Colleagues, welcome to my live stream presentation. Particular welcome to those who are in the audience with me at 1PSQ. Great to have you here, and hopefully we have a number of people joining us online for the next hour. Just a couple of quick things at the beginning. One, of course, that we're looking forward to questions from the audience here at 1PSQ, but also questions submitted online, and I think there's a button to push to put your questions through, a Q&A aspect to the live stream. So if something occurs to you at any stage during the presentation and you'd like to ask that question, please send it through to us, and we'll make sure that in the quick Q&A part of this presentation we run through those questions, as well as obviously questions coming from the audience here. And I'll be joined after a short presentation from me by Professor Kevin Dunn to enter into a discussion about higher education reform and other issues that people would like to discuss. It's also worthwhile, just before I begin, noting that today is a very, I think, important day for the university in a range of ways. This morning in particular, we had the formal launch of, formal opening of 1 Parramatta Square, this vertical campus at 169 Macquarie Street in Parramatta. It was opened by the Premier this morning, but importantly, it was not just the opening of the building, it was the naming of this building, the Peter Shergold building, that I think was particularly important, and the Chancellor was here with his wife Carol to participate in the ceremony and to say a few words at the official opening. And I know that he was very proud to be in that position, and certainly very moved by the ceremony itself. So great to have 1PSQ formally underway. The Premier actually stopped by at one of our classes, I think a first-year financial management class, and got a glimpse of the way we're using technology and the way we're flipping the classroom. There's also been some great media coverage of the opening today as well. So that's just by way of acknowledging all the work that went into the opening, and to thank all of those who've been involved. What I want to talk about and run through very quickly in the course of the next 20 minutes or so, of course, is the reform package. Timely to have this conversation with the university, because yesterday, of course, and some of you might have seen the media coverage of this, Universities Australia had its May plenary meeting in Sydney. Was my last plenary as chair of Universities Australia, and of course we spent a considerable amount of time discussing the reform package, and we released a media statement immediately after the plenary in which we indicated that Universities Australia will be opposing the cuts to higher education announced in the budget, and an overwhelming majority of Vice-Chancellors also calling on crossbenchers to particularly oppose the package in the Senate. So I think it was a strong statement by UA, and one that we can pick up the detail of and the reasons for it as we run through. The Minister, Simon Birmingham, announced what he's calling the higher education reform package on the 1st of May, before the budget. And of course, in substance, it had both cuts to higher education funding to universities through an efficiency dividend, and a rebalancing of the student contribution and the public contribution to higher education from the current 58% Commonwealth, 42% student contribution on average across the sector, to 54% contributed by the Commonwealth and 46% by students. And that sounds like a modest change, as is a 2.5% efficiency dividend, but as we'll see as we go through, there are some considerable issues in relation to both the package and, of course, the cuts. And I'll talk a little bit about the implications for the university. On the positive side, of course, the zombie measures, as they're called, the measures from the 2014 budget that the government's been unable to move through the Senate, were finally taken off the table, including fee deregulation formally, of course, but also the 20% cut to Commonwealth Grant Scheme funding, CGS funding, has been removed, but replaced by a package that in totality includes a $2.8 billion cut in the forward estimates to higher education. Substantially, of course, students picking up more of the burden, as well as well over $1 billion in cuts to university funding overall. There are a range of positives as well as negatives in the package, which is often the way in a major reform package, and there are some elements that are worth reflecting on. I'll go through these in more detail. Two things in particular that Universities Australia has been advocating for some time, that is to maintain the Higher Education Participation and Partnership Program, HEP, in its fully funded form, and to protect it through legislation. One of the problems with our HEP funding, which for us is about $11 million a year, one of the difficulties is that it is at the whim of a minister to cut HEP funding. It doesn't need to have the approval of the Senate to do that, or the House of Representatives to do that. The intention of the government is to enshrine HEP in legislation and to move it to largely a per student funding base. And we recognise that that's consistent with what UA has been calling for some time. And equally, of course, there is the opening up of the demand-driven system to include sub-bachelor load. And worth noting that there are some measures in relation to research, but largely the minister made very little comment on research or research funding. That's noteworthy in the positive sense because it means there weren't particular cuts that were outlined in the budget, and that's to be applauded. Although the sector remains deeply concerned about an unfunded roadmap for national collaborative research infrastructure. We have a roadmap announced last week, but we have no funding envelope around it. That's a concern, and clearly a concern over the indirect costs of research, which the government has wound back on commitments dating back to the Rudd and Gillard government. So the negatives, of course, the $2.8 billion on top of previous savings of over $3.9 billion in savings from cuts to the sector made by the Commonwealth. So if you put those two together, we have made a significant contribution from higher education to budget repair. I think it's very important to note that of the $3.9 billion, the single biggest item of savings by the government there was to remove scholarships for students from being a grant from the government to being a loan, which moved it off the government's books and into a loan arrangement through income contingent loans through the HELP system. So it looks good for the government at $1.4 billion, but of course it is a significant impost on students. And this is a concern that was particularly evident yesterday at UA when we discussed the impact of these budget cuts on students. In summary, students being asked to pay more for their education, but with the government providing less funding to universities to provide a high quality education. There are many reasons why we've been arguing at UA for increased investment in higher education, and I outline some of them there. The Keep It Clever policy statement that we launched in 2015 ahead of the 2016 election was an example of that. I think it makes a compelling case about the benefits to Australia from investment in higher education, whether it's through increased GDP over time, whether it's through the increased productivity in the economy from our graduates, whether it's because of the impact that our research has, or whether it's simply because education makes a difference in the lives of those who are able to achieve a tertiary qualification in particular, and the lifetime benefits that flow from that. So there are both personal benefits from higher education, but there are significant public benefits as well. But the government at the moment, despite their innovation agenda and their commitment to transitioning the Australian economy, something that will need universities right behind it, have chosen to, in fact, cut budgets. There are other aspects of the budget that are just worth touching on for a moment. Of course, the government has committed significant infrastructure funding. The $5.3 billion announced over 10 years for the construction of Western Sydney Airport. That's something the university has been strongly supporting since the announcement and since there's been bipartisan support for Western Sydney Airport, notwithstanding there are still issues to be resolved. The first plane is still meant to to take off from Western Sydney Airport in 2026. It slipped a little bit from the earlier schedule of 2025, and that's a concern in itself. But it's important that there's a commitment to the building of the airport, particularly given that Sydney Airport Corp has pulled out of the process of building this airport and running it. So it's now up to the government or potentially other interested parties, but the government stepped up and made that commitment. Disappointingly, as the note says, we're not seeing the level of commitment from the Commonwealth to rail connectivity to the airport. And that's a critically important part of making this airport truly fully functional and a real game changer from an economic perspective in Western Sydney. We're yet to see that from the federal government. So let's go back to higher education reforms very, very quickly. From the reform package itself, these were the key features announced by the government: improving the sustainability, more choice for students, and increased transparency and accountability. And I want to touch on how we are interpreting each of those elements of the package. And I'll quickly run through the various elements involved here. First of all, there is a rebalancing of the public-private contribution, and I mentioned that earlier. Students are going to be asked to contribute more as the government cuts its contribution across all of the funding clusters that support universities over the next few years. It begins modestly at about 1.8% additional impost on students through to 7.5% increase by 2021. To give it some sense of what that means, if you take a discipline like business, the funding cluster rate at the moment from the Commonwealth perspective is about $2,020 per student, very modest. Most of the funding for business students are paid by the students themselves through HELP, and the Commonwealth paying it on their behalf. That's going to be cut over the next 4 years to under $1,000 per student. So we're seeing a dramatic decrease in the funding per student from the Commonwealth. Students are being asked to make up that gap, so the contribution from students will grow. And then that's replicated in various ways across the sector. We're very concerned about this, and I know students are very, very concerned about that this shift in the burden. The efficiency dividend that's been announced, 2.5% cut in our CGS funding in 2018, and then again in 2019. It's important to realise that an efficiency dividend is in fact the cut that keeps on giving, because it resets the dollars per student that we receive from the Commonwealth. It resets the baseline, and although the Commonwealth are applying a CPI-based increase to our Commonwealth funding, once you reset the baseline, that cut in funding continues until there is some change in government policy to reset it. What does it mean for us? It means a cut of $7 million to our budget in 2018 and a cut of $15 million in 2019 and thereafter, based on our current projections of Commonwealth supported places in the university. So this is material and significant to the university by any measure. There are new repayment thresholds for HELP, which are worth noting. Again, this is an impost on students. The low threshold for repayment, the lower threshold has been reduced to $42,000 with a 1% repayment requirement. There's also a requirement for graduates on relatively high salaries to repay at a much greater rate. Generally speaking, that's a good thing. I think income contingent loans should really be focused on those entering the workforce and supporting them. For those who are receiving relatively high incomes, I think it's important to ensure they repay the loan as quickly as possible. However, lowering the threshold at the base level is a concern, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A session that will be coming up. In relation to sustainability, there are some modest changes there, or at least modest commitments from the government on cluster funding. The Office of Learning and Teaching, which the government has closed down, the final move by the government in relation to OLT and its awards program is to move the funding for those awards to Universities Australia to run. And I think we'll hear more about UA's commitment to teaching and learning for the sector over the next few months, but I can assure you that UA will be maintaining that program, but I hope announcing some more significant commitments to our efforts in ensuring that we do widely disseminate excellence in learning and teaching that's underway across Australia's universities. One of the other changes that's been widely reported relates to permanent residence. And I know that the New Zealand Prime Minister has been commenting on this. In the case of New Zealand Australian permanent residents, New Zealand citizens in Australia will no longer have access to Commonwealth supported places, so they don't get access to the subsidies. They can access, of course, the help system, but through fee help, that is to cover the full cost of their tuition rather than the subsidised cost of tuition that has applied to New Zealand citizens in Australia. They're also broadening this to all permanent residents to have access to fee help to support their Australian higher education opportunity and access. We can again come back to that in Q&A. There are some other changes which I mentioned were quite positive. The changes to HEP, moving to $985 per student, indexed per low SES student. That is very important to us. As you know, Western Sydney University, and we're very proud of this, over 25% of our students come from a low SES background. We've been looking at this very, very closely. At the moment, that would mean slightly less funding for Western Sydney University in 2018 compared to 2017. So that's a concern to us. Not as dramatically hit as some other universities. We're down, I think, about $500,000 on our projections. Other universities are indicating that they're much further down on HEP funding by moving to this loading. Importantly, HEP, if the government gets this package through the Senate, will move to a legislated program, which means for a minister to make changes to the funding rates, it would need to have the authority of Parliament. And that would make it more difficult to do what has happened in the last couple of years where the government has cut HEP because that was an opportunity to undertake budget repair without going through the approval of Parliament. There is also some additional funding for national priorities, and we'd be looking to tap into that as well. There are changes to postgraduate coursework places, and this again is an issue of concern to the sector. The government is reducing the number of Commonwealth supported places by about 3,000. Their argument is that those places are not currently filled. So this is where you can undertake postgraduate coursework study in an Australian university in an area that leads to a professional qualification and is approved by the Commonwealth, so it receives a subsidy as a Commonwealth supported place. The Commonwealth claims there are 3,000 of those places currently not taken up, in which case they believe this is going to have no material impact by withdrawing them. But more importantly, and of more concern, is a move to a voucher-based system to allocate postgraduate coursework places. And one of the concerns that was raised extensively yesterday at Universities Australia is looking at the new legislation that's just gone into the House and is now been sent to a Senate committee over the next 2 months. The architecture of higher education that is being reflected in that legislation is of deep concern to the sector, because this is, in a sense, thin edge of the wedge in terms of introduction of vouchers and the role the minister plays in the allocation of those vouchers. And I think this needs much more serious attention. It's at the moment postgraduate coursework, but a concern that this architecture reflected in the legislation could apply more deeply. So that's another we can drill down on during our Q&A session. Expansion of the demand-driven system. This has been a key element of Keep It Clever, and prior to that, a policy position of UA, that this has been an anomaly in the system, that sub-bachelor places, diploma, advanced diploma, associate degree places, largely in Australia have been capped, whereas undergraduate bachelor level places, largely with the exception of medicine, have been uncapped. In terms of demand, the demand-driven system. The government is prepared to open up sub-bachelor places to the demand-driven system. We applaud that. There are some caveats attached to it because they're very concerned about cost shifting at a state level between vocational training and higher ed, but they are fairly modest, I think, caveats. They relate to people not having a previous higher education qualification. Not having a previous qualification is a necessary prerequisite to enter a sub-bachelor program. They have to be industry relevant programs and they have to articulate through to an undergraduate program. At the moment, of course, we have a very substantial number of students in the college. that are operating through diploma programs, and we're operating within the demand-driven system. This does give us an opportunity to expand to advanced diplomas and to associate degrees, so we're looking at the implications of that. And generally seen as a positive, although I know some Vice-Chancellors have made a couple of comments this morning about some potentially negative consequences of this if we're not careful in the design side. And new arrangements for enabling. This is another savings measure from the Commonwealth, in which case the Commonwealth will shift the arrangements for enabling programs so that students who currently receive, universities receive funding for each of our enabling students doing enabling programs as a grant from the Commonwealth, that will now become a loan. So the students will be operating within the income contingent loan system. There won't be a Commonwealth subsidy. This is effectively moving money that's currently an outlay of government over to a loan arrangement. So it moves it into the help system. That's a saving of almost $500 million. So it's a big saving in the $2.8 billion package, and it puts a burden on students who are looking for that foundation pathway into higher education. It's still a capped program as well. So there's no net change in the resources that will come to universities, but there is an impost, very much an impost on students. And just to finish up, there is a contribution which, again, UA has acknowledged is a positive contribution from the government to, in a fairly modest way, continue to support work-integrated learning arrangements and provide some additional funding to universities for programs where students are doing work-integrated learning placements in industry. It's been an area where some courses have not received Commonwealth funding under the Work Experience in Industry program. That's now been expanded. There's more funding available. It's modest in terms of numbers, but it's a very important direction to set. And finally, of course, improved access and support for the establishment and maintenance of up to 8 community-owned regional study hubs. That we already see those in Geraldton in Western Australia and Coomera in New South Wales. These are sites where multiple universities come together in regional Australia to offer programs. In principle, it's very positive to see that expanded. We need to understand some of the detail of how they will operate, and we're waiting to see that. Transparency and accountability, I'll touch on briefly, and again, we can work through this in the Q&A aspects. But of course, an area of significant concern to the sector is the announcement of a 7.5% performance funding arrangement that will operate from 2018. This is putting 7.5% of our Commonwealth funding at risk on an annual basis against performance targets which have not been clearly at all delineated. For 2018, it's fairly modest in terms of what we expect the government to ask of universities. We have to agree to implement the recommendations of the Higher Education Standards Panel in relation to transparency on admissions, something that UA has supported and we certainly support, and also to make some modifications to our financial reporting arrangements to enable the government to compare the sector more easily in terms of costs of teaching and learning and other issues. So that's the 2018 hurdle. The 2019 hurdle, of course, is of serious concern. The government's committed to a process of working this through, but this is the most serious area of concern to the sector. In terms of quantum, for us, it's upwards of $21 to $25 million a year at risk based on our performance against indicators that might relate to retention, student satisfaction, a whole range of other indicators, quilt related, and the next generation of quilt, all of which we recognise the importance of in terms of accountability. We recognise the importance of ensuring that students and prospective students and parents have access to information about those quality indicators, but then to put at risk such a significant amount of funding in the sector by virtue of a 7.5% performance fund. There's no new money here. This is just simply taxing universities who underperform. The Minister claims that money will be reinvested in the sector, but we'll have to wait and see. He hasn't actually committed to reinvesting it into higher education. It's within the portfolio, and we're waiting to see the details of that. So I think there are concerns, and we can again in Q&A drill down on some of that. There are some other issues that relate to reviews to be undertaken in the sector. One is the cost of delivery, the cost of the delivery of teaching and learning issue. The government wants to work through that with universities in more detail. And there's also an issue here of some concern, and that is the review of the criteria for higher education providers to commence later this year. This is an interesting issue because it goes to the heart of what it means to be a university, the criteria we have to meet in order to satisfy TEXA that we're a university. We're going through our re-registration process at the moment as a university in a 7-year cycle with TEXA. It is interesting for the government to want to open this up, particularly if you look at some things happening in the UK. So we're cautious about it, want to know where the government's heading, but again, there is a lack of detail. Another quick set of issues, I won't go through these in detail, but the Education Investment Fund, which we've been concerned about for some time, it's the only sorts of capital funding for teaching and research, which has been in abeyance now for several years. The government is committed to closing it down. It needs legislation to do it, and in fact to move the $3.7 billion in that fund to support the NDIS. We don't for a moment have a concern about the importance of the NDIS and the need for investment in it and its sustainability. The $3.7 billion in the Education Investment Fund is equally being seen as a vitally important part of building the infrastructure of the sector, particularly in research terms, which there are no significant allocations for. There are some modest elements of university research announcements. I won't go through those. We could pick them up in more detail during the Q&A. I did want to finish with a few quick comments about matters we might pick up again in the Q&A session in detail. Last week I announced the review of our university strategic plan and also a review of our academic structure, and that Professor Sharon Bell, our newly appointed DVC Strategy and Planning, will be leading the consultation around the university in relation to both the strategic plan. It's mid-cycle for our strategic plan, timely to revisit that. Also in the context of these challenging circumstances we're facing, and the budget illustrates that, have we got the right academic structure for the future? And it is timely for us to look at our flat school structure and see whether we should move to a faculty structure of some description. But we are very keen on hearing from staff across the university in relation to that, and Sharon will lead the consultation process. We have an objective of bringing back the results of that after a lengthy discussion inside the university to the Board of Trustees in October. As many of you will know, part of our strategy for diversifying our sources of revenue for the university, critical at a time when we're under pressure and there are budget cuts ahead of us. We've been working on a project called Western Growth, which is really about how our campuses are developed into the future. This building is an example of a strategic aspect of Western Growth. I'm sure staff are well aware of the developments at our Westmead campus, where we've already sold one particular aspect of that campus for residential development. We're maintaining a presence there as a part of a health and education precinct, and we're also in the market for co-development of 2 other allotments at Westmead at the moment, but that's about generating revenue streams for the university in the long term. We have announced, of course, our Liverpool campus to open early next year. This is a vertical campus, not dissimilar to 1PSQ, but of more modest scale. Important for us to establish our presence in Liverpool with competition in that region. It's very much about how we utilise Liverpool as a major campus for the university, its relationship with Milpera into the future. Similarly, of course, we have our residential development underway at Campbelltown, and we have other additional land holdings there for development, and we're looking into that as a future revenue generating source. Of course, around our Kingswood and Warrington campuses, we're looking at long-term planning there, and our Hawkesbury and Narimba campuses. So Western Growth is very much about the future of those campuses, the development that can go on, how that can generate revenue sources for us, how that can make us both less reliant on Commonwealth funding, and also to build a corpus, an investment corpus for the future, so we can have more certainty about our funding in the long term and also manage the volatility that we're seeing in the system at the moment. And we are in the beginning, of course, of a curriculum reform project that Denise Kirkpatrick will be leading. And this is a very important part of our future. I think it's recognised that the architecture of our curriculum across our course offerings needs to be addressed. It has some historic challenges. In a time when greater flexibility is required, we need to look at that in some detail, and that curriculum project is moving forward this year and will be a major feature of activity in 2018 as well.
Yeah. Welcome everyone, and thanks very much Professor Glover for that address on the higher education reforms. We have received some questions in advance, and I will go to one of those, received anonymously, which I'll ask in a moment, and then we'll certainly look to the audience for questions here physically, and we are monitoring the webinar for the questions as well. So there are 3 sources of questions for the rest of the balance.
And Kevin, I could just to add before we jump into the questions, in a multi-campus university like ours, and one where we are Australia's, I think it's most significant user of Zoom as one technology, you know, we are looking to ways to engage with staff and communicate across the organisation, but we want it to be two-way communication. So I do encourage our colleagues who are watching online to take an opportunity to send a question through. So just by way of additional encouragement.
Okay, well, thank you, and please do. So the first question that we received anonymously was this. The questioner says, Vice-Chancellor, Western Sydney University has in the past few years undergone a number of reviews. Ernst & Young, IBM, now Service Unlimited, now Deloitte. Most of these have yielded efficiencies and strengths in our schools and in our units as we carry this into the troubled times ahead financially. Do we now have the stability, or are we going to continue to have to strip back university services and staff?
I think the presentation I just gave, and one of the reasons that yesterday Universities Australia made such a strong statement in opposition to the reform package, is an indication that there are some challenging times ahead if this package gets through the Senate. And I guess we should perhaps at some point talk about that. So we are facing continuing stress as an organisation, and we are still a university in the Australian system very highly reliant on Commonwealth funding. Only 11% of our load is international. So in order to make up for volatility in our performance at undergraduate recruitment level from international is a long-term strategy. It's certainly not a short-term strategy. The budget cuts add additional complexity to that if they move through the Senate. And of course, we are coming off a period in 2016 and 2017 where our performance against target in commensurate load terms is down on our expectations, and that adds financial pressure to the university. So the short answer is I appreciate that the shared services project and other projects that we have undertaken in recent times, including the early voluntary retirement scheme that operated at the end of last year, put stress on our staff, and I appreciate that. At the moment, we have considerably less resource to support the institution overall than we had anticipated. So that's the reality of the environment we're in. We do need to look for ways to be more efficient in the way we provide services and deliver our programs, and we're looking at that. Shared services is very much about that. And so it's, if anything, it's a far more important project than it was prior to the budget cuts. So from that perspective, I certainly appreciate the challenge that this throws at us, but they are very important projects and we need to work through them. The next, particularly the next month or so will be particularly important with shared services, as many of the change proposals go out for consultation. I'd encourage staff to contribute to that process so we can finalise that as quickly as possible. Similarly, in terms of the discussion around academic structure that Sharon will lead, another very important process for people to be involved in about the most efficient and effective structure for our schools into the future. So the circumstances make these very important parts, and we're not alone. I think people who are following the media on higher education will know that there are, in fact, a number of Australian universities that are working through very similar processes at the moment. I think the University of Newcastle's been in the media very recently. Curtin University, I think it was announced they had a $16 million shortfall on revenue this year, so they're looking at additional responses to that. I think the University of Tasmania is also looking at some very significant staffing issues that they need to respond to, and the list goes on. I think one of the challenges in this federal budget, and again, we can tease this out, Kevin, the government made clear that the arguments that they were putting for change in the sector were based on assumptions or an understanding on the part of the government that the sector had capacity to absorb cuts. And there may be a few universities in the sector with significant surpluses that are able to absorb cuts of the magnitude that I've been discussing. That is not true for the majority of universities in Australia, particularly not for regional universities and outer suburban universities in Australia. And in that context, there is going to be considerable pressure on the sector if these reforms are successful. And I think one of the reasons that not only should UA strenuously oppose them, but we will be too. And I've made sure that we'll be making a submission to the Senate inquiry, and I will be looking to appear before the Senate inquiry to make it clear the impact on Western Sydney University from these cuts is significant and needs to be taken into account if Australia wants to commit itself long-term to a high-quality higher education system.
You mentioned that Western has fallen short of our commensurate load targets. Can you give us a sense of how much that is? And you also mentioned that this is common amongst other universities. Is it a sector-wide issue, the commensurate load issue, or have we been too bullish in our forecasts?
No, we're certainly not being too bullish in our forecasts. In fact, our forecasting, certainly for this year and over the next couple of years, in terms of domestic load, is showing, if not static domestic load, so no growth at all, or very modest growth, because we recognise, we see the demographics of Western Sydney. We know what particularly in the current school leaver category, because let's be honest about it, the current school leaver category, mature age students, have been in decline in New South Wales for a number of years. So that's a much tighter market, and it's a market we rely heavily on. If we go to current school leavers, that is an area where there's very little growth, but you have a situation with great competition between universities. So to answer your questions, is it across the board that we're seeing universities challenged in terms of load? No, because it's volatility that's the difficulty. Some universities are more successful than others in attracting load because of various circumstances. That creates volatility. That volatility means universities need to manage some very difficult and tight financial circumstances. This year we are down in total about 1,200 equivalent full-time students. That is a significant challenge for us, and it is of a similar dimension to last year, to 2016. There are positives as well. We're up on continuing load. We've been successful, I think, in keeping more of our students. Our retention activities and working to limit attrition have been successful, and we're pleased about that. International is looking robust for us this year. But they are not at a scale that they can counteract a lot of volatility on the domestic undergraduate load position. The college is stable, but not a great deal of growth. Our cost structures are going up. We need to respond to those challenging circumstances.
To accommodate that foregone revenue, are we still able to achieve an operating surplus? Do we need an operating surplus?
We certainly need an operating surplus. In fact, this is one of the aspects that the government used. They used a Deloitte report from 2016. It was a report that they commissioned to look at the cost of delivery of higher education across the sector. They had, I think, 18 universities that provided information into that assessment. And the government compared that with a much more limited survey that was done during the Lomax-Smith base funding review several years ago. And one of the opening statements in the Deloitte report that's been used by the government to justify their efficiency dividend is a statement that says you cannot use the data in the Deloitte report and compare it with the data of previous studies for a whole range of methodological reasons. You cannot compare. The government has chosen to compare, and they've used a growth of about 15% over 5 or 6 years in revenue in Australian universities, and their assessment of a 9% increase in costs. They're saying there's a 6% efficiency that's emerged in the sector over that time, hence we've got the capacity to take a cut. And it's false for a range of reasons. One is you can't do the comparison that they've done, And I know that a number of people have been making this argument very strongly to the government. The Minister and the Treasurer are yet to acknowledge that problem. But equally, in that same period of time, we've been in a situation where there's been no infrastructure funding to the sector. So we've been dealing with having to fund our capital programs out of cash flow and limited surplus. Plus, of course, the reality is that the surpluses that are generated in Australia's universities hide a very challenging cash flow context that needs to be understood. We receive funding for research, for example. We don't spend all of that in 1 year. It appears as a surplus in our accounts, and the next year it's spent. And that's just timing issues, and our finance team does a great job in managing all that. But it can give you a false impression of the true level of a surplus. And I think the estimate from UA is it's about 20%. It's inflating the surplus level by about 20%. So those sorts of issues haven't been taken into account. Plus, at the moment, there are 8 universities in 2015 in Australia in deficit. And at the moment, there are a number of others in technical deficit. So it is a challenge to have a university that whose expenditure exceeds its revenue. And it's not a situation that we can allow Western Sydney University to be in. So yes, we need a surplus. Yes, we have a board of trustees willing to accommodate a modest surplus. And I think that's important. We've got great support from the board. But this year, our surplus projection was around 10 million off revenues of around 750 million. So it's a very modest surplus and much lower than the benchmark set by, for example, TEXA. At the moment, TEXA have indicated they have some significant concerns about the health of the sector as a whole because of the pressures that are being applied financially. So there are concerns about the basis under which the Minister made the decision to apply an efficiency dividend and the impact that that's going to have on the sector.
If the sector grows, if there's more students, there are economies of scale. I mean, they are savings, and universities are reaping them. Isn't that fair?
We certainly saw in the first flush of the demand-driven system, we saw increases in student numbers. That's not the case now across the sector. I think national growth is running at about 1%. So we've seen that growth, that unmet demand being swept up by the sector, and now it's stabilised. So there's not a lot of domestic growth, and growth in international load is very much concentrated in the sector at the moment at the group of 8 end of the spectrum, where they are seeing very significant growth, particularly from China. The rest of the sector, it's much more modest growth. So even in that context, it's limited. And of course, our costs have been going up significantly.
Can Western absorb these efficiency dividends in 2018 and 19?
Well, no university can absorb them. So to say that you can absorb those cuts would be implying that you have a component of your surplus that you're willing to sacrifice for the efficiency dividend. That's simply not the case. We need that funding. It supports a whole range of our activities. It's important to us in terms of our cash flow. It's important to us for our infrastructure projects around all of our campuses. It's vitally important to our capacity to invest in our future. So yes, we need to generate a surplus, and the efficiency dividend will be very challenging for this university and for every Australian university to absorb. I think Vice-Chancellors yesterday at the UA plenary were consistently making this point about just how difficult it is to consider absorbing it without the consequent challenges of how do we reduce our expenditure where there's limited growth opportunities on revenue. What do we do to be more efficient as organisations so that we can free up resources? Obviously, some universities are looking at the challenges around their staffing profiles and whether there needs to be a change there. These are all the sorts of issues that universities need to look at, and we're working through that at the moment. And we will do over the course of the next few months as we set the 2018 and 2019 budgets.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. I'll ask one more question, and then I'll look to Leanne after that for a question from the webinar. 7.5% performance element in these budgets. You said it may be as much as $20 million for Western on the line. What sort of targets, performance targets, do you imagine? You mentioned maybe some sort of quilt indicators or maybe admissions clarity. What do you think the Turnbull government might set for universities by way of?
It's a very good question, Kevin, and I'm not sure anybody really knows at the moment. The Minister was fairly vague about it when he announced the reform package, and you wonder a little bit about the motivation to introduce a performance funding mechanism like this. The United Kingdom has introduced or is introducing a thing called the Teaching Excellence Framework, which is a mechanism for monitoring some proxies of performance and quality in higher education in the UK, and to use that as the means for those who perform well to allow them to increase their fees for students to bring more revenue in. It's a model that's been soundly and roundly criticised in the UK. What we're looking at here is not any additional funding mechanism. This is to be punitive. So to say to a university, well, you've dropped below a performance target, we are now going to withdraw 7.5% of your Commonwealth funding, is actually ludicrous because it's a catastrophic impact. You cannot forward plan your budgets as we do over 3 to 4 year cycles when you are dealing with the vagaries of lagging data on performance. Now, at the moment, our Chancellor is leading the Higher Education Standards Panel, looking at the question of retention and attrition in the sector at the request of the Minister. Now, this is an important project. I'm sure that Professor Shergold's report will go to the Minister in the next few months. We look forward to seeing the outcomes of that. But all the information that we have available to us at UA tells us two very important things about retention, for example, as an indicator. First of all, the Australian system is the third best in the world when it comes to retention, and much better than the United Kingdom or the United States. So we are one of the best systems in keeping students in higher education. And secondly, over the last decade, even taking into account the growth that you were referring to from the demand-driven system, we have seen virtually no change in the level of retention and attrition in the sector. And I think that demonstrates the sector's responded to increased load and has been supporting students. If I added a third, it would be some of the work that we're doing at the moment that is showing that even after 7 or 8 years, students who might have left the system, so they have attrited from higher education, come back to complete at various times of their lives. And we're not taking account of that movement. Plus, of course, we have such a diverse system. We have universities that are focused on online education for mature age students who are working. And that cohort has a very different set of characteristics when it comes to attrition and retention than a GO8 that deals predominantly with undergraduate school leavers. How do you compare? How do you set national benchmarks that are not going to be in some way punitive? And of course, many of the indicators that we might look at as potentially indicators that could form the base for benchmarks for performance are not completely within the control of universities. You know, we talk a lot about graduate employability as an indicator. It's important and we're very focused on it, like most universities are. We've just seen an improvement nationally in graduate employability, just notionally back above 70%. That's employment 4 months out of graduation. That's positive. If you look at the longitudinal data, we're a bit below the sector average on that particular indicator. But if you go out longitudinally, look out at a 5-year study, we're actually above the average. Our students are in employment at levels above the national average. So where's the indicator going to sit? And how much control do we have of the economy? Because the economy dictates the nature of employment, of graduates and non-graduates. So you've got to be careful in the way we use proxies on quality. Student satisfaction indicators and others have questionable relationships with assessments of quality of an institution. And of course, everyone is concerned that you'll set perverse drivers of behaviour. And we've got to be very careful that we don't set up a system that rewards retention and student satisfaction above quality graduate outcomes and other indicators. So it's a very fraught area, and the government's placing a great deal of emphasis on 7.5% of Commonwealth funding. That's huge.
Concerning. In the not too distant past, federal governments have attached industrial relations changes to this sort of contingent funding. How would the university respond to that sort of interference?
I think there is no chance of the Turnbull government beginning an industrial relations campaign similar to work choices or the various changes to higher education workplace agreements that existed some time ago. I just don't think there's a political appetite for it on the part of the coalition, and I think there is no way the Senate would tolerate it given the balance of Senate at the moment. So it's not a question that's going to arise. Having said that, many universities at the moment are involved in enterprise bargaining across the sector. Deakin has just finalised its enterprise agreement, and many other universities are in bargaining. So it's a difficult time to be bargaining for the next period, where we're dealing with both the uncertainties of this budget and generally the volatility in the sector.
Okay. Do we have a question, Leanne, from afar?
Yes, we do. Joe Holland submitted a question. How will the financial strain on the university impact on the delivery of student support services, particularly disability services, welfare and counselling services?
Well, I think we could apply that same question to a whole lot of parts of the university. And at the moment, we're dealing with the reality of the reform package and how we can argue powerfully to the government and to the crossbenchers that this package needs to be reconsidered. So let's try and work through that process. We need to contingency plan, and obviously we'll, like all Australian universities, let me make that clear, like all Australian universities, the financial envelope is going to be constrained. So we need to look right across service provision. I'm certainly confident that the university will navigate its way through that, but that doesn't mean I can say that there aren't services that will be that will have to be constrained in some way. We need to work through that as a proper process. But at the moment, I think we need to be focused on a government with a particular piece of legislation, which I think is quite challenging. And how do we do something about opposing that?
Thank you. Yep, we've got another one that's come through. Vice-Chancellor, it seems that many of the proposed reforms reflect a shifting of the cost of higher education from the Commonwealth to the individual student. Does the university have a plan to address student concerns which may arise particularly from our student cohort, given they're a population of comparatively less financially advantaged Australians?
Would it affect demand as well?
That's a very good question. I think the work that was done just on that part of the question and come back to the overall issue. There has been some discussion at the moment across the sector about the potential impact on demand. When we looked at patterns of demand and elasticity in the context of deregulation, the sort of work we did then, there seemed to be a recognition that that students were prepared to pay more for a high quality education, provided they understood what the additional resources were going to be used for to value add to the student experience. In other words, universities under a deregulated environment would have had to have made a very strong and powerful case that the additional revenue was going to improve graduate outcomes, to improve career preparedness, to improve work experience opportunities and so on for students. Well, now we're in a situation where students are paying more, but there's less resource available from the Commonwealth. And I think there is a concern for our students at the burden that they'll be carrying. Coupled with that, and again, we haven't got the results yet, it'll be later this year, but Universities Australia are doing their 5-yearly student finance review. This is a very critical time to be looking at the circumstances students are facing, the financial challenges they're facing. So if you layer on top of that additional debt burden and the likelihood of having to repay debt at a much lower salary, then I think there are serious concerns here, not just for our students, but right across the sector. So I think we need to be working collectively. The students are very, not just our students, the National Union of Students and others are very active at the moment in campaigning for overturn of these cuts. And I think that the statement yesterday from UA is very supportive of that. And of course, we now need to get into the political fray.
Income contingent loans are a virtuous mechanism for funding higher education. And you made the point earlier about people earning high incomes and encouraging them as soon as possible to repay those debts. But I think the questioner might be having more in mind someone who's earning $42,000.
Yes.
I mean, that doesn't sound appropriate. Have they really benefited from their degree? I mean, we wouldn't support that.
No, I think it's a concern that the threshold's been lowered. I think, particularly, I think for women in some professions who are in part-time work, that will be oscillating above and below this threshold. So you'll see an additional repayment burden on them. And so from that perspective, it is a concern that the threshold's been lowered. And it seems a modest measure. I certainly support accelerating repayments for higher income earners. I mean, I think the data's out there to show that we do have some graduates across the sector on relatively high incomes who are holding significant HECS debt, help debt. And I think they should be encouraged to repay that more quickly. I think that's reasonable. But at the lower end, I think there are real concerns about it.
Thank you. Leanne.
Sure. One final question that ties in a little bit with the first question. With the heavier reliance on technology and automation, is there an investment in enabling support technicians to be able to support these services effectively?
Well, if I understand the issue correctly, I think that we are, as an institution, very conscious of our multi-campus nature and the fact that we need to reach students in a variety of ways. We're relaunching our online delivery at the moment through our relationship with OES, and that'll come into play later in the year. And of course, if we're increasing our technology, we need to ensure that we have the support for staff and students in the way in which they engage with that technology. And I can't see that lessening into the future. I think our technology footprint is expanding, and it should, because our students are demanding access to those sort of technology opportunities as they inform teaching and learning, but also as they inform the way we support students in an online as well as on campus or blended way. So yes, it will continue to be important to us. We need to, of course, do it in the most cost-effective way.
The questioner mentioned investment, and earlier you mentioned Western growth and the emerging corpus. The university is using some of its holdings, such as at Westmead and other places, to lease and to sell assets. What order of magnitude will that corpus reach in the years ahead, and what does the university intend to do with it?
That's a very good question. At the moment, it's a very early stage because the flow of resources from our activities is only in the very early stages. As you can imagine, the Campbelltown Residential Estate, which is one of the very early examples of how we can generate revenue from our campus assets, that's really maturing now, and over the next 2 or 3 years, we'll see a flow of resources into the university from that. The Westmead initiative will generate some funding this year from the sale of a large allotment for residential development. The other developments there will take much longer to see revenue flows, and we're not looking to sell the land, we're looking to co-develop the land. So we get annuity streams, we get revenue in the long term from the development of those assets. And in the very long term, if we look out a decade from now, the university would like to have a corpus of between $300 or $400 million, which is actually relatively modest when you think that the University of Sydney raised $750 million over the last 2 years from philanthropy alone. And many other universities have relatively a large corpus and endowment. And of course, we need that to generate revenue flow, to generate discretionary funding for 2 reasons. One, to invest in teaching and learning and research for our future, but importantly, to help us manage volatility. And until there's strong growth again in higher education in Western Sydney, of course, we'll need to be able to buffer that volatility. But it's actually interesting to imagine over the next decade, as Western Sydney grows, and if we look at the school leaver population over the next decade, you see growth in that regard. There are a lot of universities in Australia looking at exactly the same set of data because they're thinking, well, there's no growth in my region. What am I going to do? Well, maybe I'm going to set up a campus in Blacktown or Liverpool or Penrith or Parramatta, and that'll heighten competition. Competition's a good thing. It'll drive quality and efficiency, but we've got to be careful about competition at a time when it leads to volatility, and how do we manage the volatility.
Leanne, do we have any more questions?
We've got one final question from Rhonda Griffiths.
Yes.
You could be next, yeah. Rhonda Griffiths. Rhonda,
Yep.
Great to have Rhonda back.
Given that demand has not increased significantly over the past few years since uncapping places, is there an appetite for the government to replace the caps, if for no other reason than to relieve the financial situation for universities who have a significant and growing deficit and declining demand for places?
First of all, because that was a question from Rhonda, I should acknowledge how well our nursing program is doing, not simply being rated, I think, number 4 in the world in a recent ranking. And as lead Dean Global Rankings, you're well aware of that, Kevin.
Absolutely.
So to congratulate our nursing and midwifery staff, that was a great outcome. And I congratulate them from Rhonda's period and now Deb Hatcher as Dean. It's a very good question about what happens to the demand-driven system. At the moment, the demand-driven system, and it's to be expanded by this coalition government, but both sides of politics are committed to it. So I can't imagine a government introducing caps. There is always discussion with government and with the opposition around moderating growth, because we see some regions of the country where there's no growth. And so you need to manage those circumstances. But there are other regions in which there is growth, and you need to be able to provide opportunities for access and participation in higher education in that context. So it's quite complex to simply have a single national policy decision to recap the system. And it's equally challenging when we've got stability of load now, that we've worked through a process of growing the demand-driven system to a very stable level. So there's not a strong argument for recapping. We've created the demand-driven system and it has challenges, and volatility in a flat market is a real concern, but I don't think we'll see any recapping, and I don't think there are any other policy instruments that the government could introduce or that the opposition could suggest. It's a Labor legacy policy, so Labor will, I'm sure, continue to support it strongly, and I think it is politically difficult for a coalition government to move away from it, because it would be suggesting that some students able to come to university wouldn't have an opportunity. And I don't think that's a political position they want to put themselves in.
Vice-Chancellor, thanks, Rhonda. If you could just say who you are too, thanks for those people afar.
Elfrida Sankool from the School of Law. UA's united and intelligent advocacy for the sector is impressive. And I'm also delighted that they're talking with NUS. But UA's advocacy could be seen by the general public and government as self-serving. Is there some way that UA could work with the students to appropriately galvanise them so that their voice could be heard?
It's always a difficult challenge for Universities Australia to advocate at a time when a government very strongly indicates it needs to undertake a tough budget repair process. I think it was interesting that the Minister made the announcements about higher education and $2.8 billion worth of cuts in the evening on a Monday night, and was out promoting Gonski 2.0 the next day very strongly. You could argue that that might have been a way of diverting any consideration of higher ed in the media cycle. Self-serving, well, only to the extent I think that we are all about continuing a high quality higher education system in this country, recognising that the burden, as I pointed out earlier, both in the $3.9 billion worth of cuts that have already happened and in the $2.8 billion, students are taking a lion's share of the burden. And we need to recognise that and support them. I think NUS will be very keen to make their own mark on this campaign, and UA also, through its advocacy, both with the government, with the opposition, with the Greens and with the crossbenchers, will be putting a very strong view, and I think we became very public about that yesterday. And there is an inquiry that will report, I think, in mid-August. UA will make a submission to that. We'll make a submission to it. As I said, I'd like to appear before that inquiry, because I think the cuts are unjustified. I think it's important to put it, I know self-serving is an easy comment to make in a way, but UA has spent several years now, I think, arguing from a strong evidence base about the benefits to Australia, even in times of financial challenge, that investment in higher education increases significantly GDP, increasing the health and well-being of the nation and of the individuals. It's both a societal benefit and an individual benefit. And there is still a significant premium attached to a higher education qualification in a lifetime context. So I think we need the government to recognise, particularly when they keep talking about innovation and changing the nature of the economy and getting away from resources, bear in mind that international education is the largest non-resources export Australia has. And it will probably hit $26 billion this year. For all of those reasons, I think the arguments are compelling for investment. At the very least, maintain and give us stability. So I don't accept the argument that it's self-serving if it's in the national interest.
I just said it could be seen to be self-serving.
Yes, I've realised that. And you're not the only one who says that. I was just gearing myself up for it.
Well geared.
Well practiced. Just one last question. You mentioned vouchers for postgraduate coursework.
Yeah.
It sounds like Milton Friedman's dream of voucher-based education funding might be upon us. Is this the thin end of the wedge?
Look, I think it's a concern. It's more of a concern now that people are actually looking at the legislation. To give you one example of what's in the legislation, there is the discretion for the minister to, at the level of an individual student, to award a voucher. The legislation provides this mechanism. You can imagine a number of circumstances where that level of intervention by a minister is questionable. Even at the timing, for example, of a federal election could mean a minister's in caretaker mode, and so universities and thousands of students are unable to receive vouchers for a student to trade in. There was an article in a higher education journal I was reading this week. I think this is true, I may be wrong, that one of the few places in the world that has maintained a long-term voucher system is the Republic of Georgia, and they are having some serious trouble with their voucher system. I think we need to think very carefully about this, because there's a more important high-level issue here about the architecture of higher education and the autonomy of universities and the funding mechanism that supports us. And at the moment, the legislation seems to be, although at the moment focused solely on postgraduate coursework vouchers, but you could imagine this extending to the RTS scheme. This could be relatively easy to extend or expand, and that would be a considerable concern to the sector. We need to work this through with the government to understand better their intention and the implications of it. And at the moment, I think the anxiety levels are high. But can I add, I think one of the other challenges of the whole 2014 to 2017 period in terms of education, higher education reform, is the fact that government has done this through budget announcements. This is a very challenging way of announcing reform, because you announce it in a budget process tied to financial considerations, and then you go immediately to legislation. We need to move reform to a white paper, green paper consultation process where the full details are worked through, that we understand the implications, the government has access to that information, and then can move to Parliament to debate a legislative change. I think this concept of a consultation, very little information about the package and an announcement of budget is a challenging and difficult and I think problematic way of undertaking national policy reform.
Well, on that note, I think that's a good place where we might end our discussion today. Thank you all for your questions that have been sent from your computer stations, and those who have had questions in the room, and those that sent questions in advance. And thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for attempting to answer those questions today.
And I think that we're also, this is recorded, so people who haven't been able to watch can watch at a later date. And thank you, Kevin, for participating in this, and I'm sure we'll have other discussions in the future.